All right. Mic check. I'm good. So I'm Max Ceron. Max Ceron, CWB Association Welding podcast. Today we have a really cool guest. Welding podcast.
The show is about to begin.
Hello and welcome to another edition of the CWB Association podcast. My name is Max Ceron and I'm with you guys again here as always online, and I hope you guys are ready for a fantastic show. We have a legend in the industry. He's smiling because I don't know if he likes that term, but you know, I've heard his name on and off throughout the years, and you know, once I started looking for guests, a lot of people threw his name at me as someone I should reach out to. So we got Mick Pates here, who's coming to us from Ottawa. So Mick, how are you doing?
Very well, thank you, Max. Beautiful day, snowing here.
Yeah, you know, we got a beautiful day in Regina too, and it's good because I got to get on the highway right after and drive 6 hours. So, you know, it's good. It's nice out there.
Yeah, it's pretty today.
So
Very pretty.
right off the top, Mick, for the people that are listening, they're gonna hear that you got a bit of an accent. So let's start from there, Mick. Where were you born? Where do your roots come from?
Okay, well, I like to say that I've got a mid-Atlantic accent, Max, but I'm reminded that I don't every now and then. Originally, I'm from the north of England. For those who know that country, north of Manchester, not far from the Scottish border, actually. For a small town called Barrow-in-Furness, which has a claim to fame, actually, and its claim to fame is that it's a peninsula. So not many people go there, but it does, in fact, produce nuclear submarines, and one of the only places in the world that does that. So that's its big claim to fame. So that's where I'm from originally. I spent time in other places in the UK before I came to Canada, Birmingham, and in Leicester particularly. So
Those submarines
came over here.
Those submarines that they built there, they're not the same ones that caught on fire and sank, that got sold to the Canadian government, are they?
No, that's an interesting story, because the one that caught on fire on its way over here was in fact built at the same yard. The history on that is that, you know, the Royal Navy bought for non-nukes, and then, you know, as governments do, they had a new white paper and they became surplus, and Canada bought them, modified them for Canadian needs and sailed them over, and that's when that fire occurred. But they were actually built in the same yard, non-nukes though.
Yeah. So
the principle is nuclear submarines. That's what they build there.
So you said, okay, you lived, you were born in the north of England and kind of grew up there and traveled around. Now, at what age did you come over?
Oh, I was in my late 20s. I like to say that I was a little bit retarded, slowed down, if you will, on my trip through our business, because in my early years, I didn't really pursue the business per se. I was more interested in playing rugby, actually, and completely didn't really care about welding, to be frank. I was doing non-destructive testing in a shipyard, and then one day I just decided I should do something, and so I went back to school when I was already 23. Most people are graduating at that, you know, from university or colleges at that age, and I decided to go up then. So I was a little bit mature when I got there, which helped, actually. It means my grant lasted longer. I didn't have to go down the pub as much because I'd already done that.
And you know, that's amazing, because I was the same way. I didn't get back in. I didn't take welding seriously for probably 10 years, you know, so.
It's amazing, really, because when I think back, and often, and I've done a little bit of teaching and done some for the Bureau, actually. And one of the things I'd like to say is that, you know, I could never have been in a more useful environment, even though I wasn't particularly that aware of it, Max, until late in my later years, how beneficial it was to be surrounded every day by welding acts building bits of submarines. And, you know, even though my interest was in playing rugby, that stuff obviously rubs off on you, and later in life it rubbed off big time, because I realized how valuable it was. I mean, I'm running off at my mouth here, but I'll just, background is, I mean, that's submarines were, as you were aware, are built of high tensile steel, quenched and tempered hull.
Mm-hmm.
And then on board you have, a nuclear reactor, which is essentially an austenitic stainless steel. And then all these systems that use seawater principally for cooling and everything, copper nickels, aluminum bronzes because of the corrosion. And at the time, did that matter to me? No, but it was all going on all around me, and obviously stayed there. So that when I got more serious about being in the business we're in, those things came home, and it certainly helped me in my career. There's no doubt about it. I couldn't have asked for a better start, really.
Yeah. When you went back to
And
school
I
at
wasn't welding it.
Yeah, when you went back to school at
Go ahead.
23, what did you go back to school for? What was it specifically that you went back to study?
Well, physical metallurgy. At the yard, at the shipyard, I'd actually started in metallurgy, and they took me out and put me into non-destructive testing, which at the time I didn't realize how important that would be. And I actually served an apprenticeship, if you can imagine, because the yard was big enough to be able to have its own programs
Mm-hmm.
at an apprentice training school. And so they asked me to step out of the met lab. I was only just getting going, and go into this fairly expanding NDT group. So, we qualified with radiography, ultrasonics, LPI, and MPI. And I was qualified when I decided I want to get into something else. And I want to get back into that physical metallurgy thing I had some interest in. So, yeah, I decided to quit the yard and go and do physical metallurgy as my first degree,
And that's interesting
which I did.
because
And
that's a program that's not offered in very many places in the world. It's actually having a physical metallurgy, pathway for a degree. There's I think only two colleges in Canada that offer that, and you obviously had access to it in England there.
Well, that's one of the reasons I found it fairly easy to get a job in Canada. I mean, because there was no physical metallurgy. Most of the metallurgy, certainly when I was younger, and I'm not so sure now, but was based on extraction metallurgy programs here for obvious reasons,
Mm-hmm.
because we have a lot of ores that we have to get out of the ground and extract. But when I applied to jobs in Canada, and I was interested in coming because I'd hitched around as a student. I fell in love with Montreal. That's the bottom line. I went to Montreal one summer as a student, and it was just glorious. There was festivals on, and I thought, I need to have some of this. And when I applied, it was I didn't realize at the time that physical metallurgy in Canada was pretty small. There was
Mm-hmm.
not a lot of people doing it, and so when I was interviewed, that was a big deal in my interview, that I had a little bit of physical metallurgy background, and of course I'd worked too. I'd got out of college by then, and I took a master's in welding technology as well. And then when I got out, I was back into building nuclear reactors, and for a different company than the original one. And so this was all by the time I was like in my late 20s, and when I was interviewed by the person who brought me over here, um, physical metallurgy was a big thing. So yeah, you're right. We need to do more of it. I'm not sure where the programs are now. I'm sure you know better than me, because you've been involved in the academic side much more than I have.
I think Waterloo
And you have a countryman,
yeah, and also
Waterloo, yes.
and I think
Um,
and Edmonton at the CCWJ. So with past Patricio Mendez, I think they have it there as well. So
yes, almost a countryman, right?
yeah.
So, yeah. I haven't met Pitt. Well, I met him briefly twice, but we're a long way away. But yeah, I mean, here in Ottawa, when I was working here, and the reason I'm in Ottawa is because the company I was working for at the time was transferred here. It's a long story. We don't want to get into that. But we had a tremendous metallurgical environment here on the welding side, because we had CanMet here.
Mm-hmm.
CanMet was a big driver. CanMet is now at the campus on McMaster in Hamilton. They moved it, which made a lot of sense so it was integrated with the university that had a physical metallurgy program. But working with all the scientists and engineers down at CAMA here when they were in Ottawa was a big deal. It really was.
And it's
It was kind of
amazing.
like what's going on. Pardon?
Yeah, it's amazing because
Sorry?
so much of the connection that you had coming into the country is similar with my family because my dad studied physical metallurgy at the University of Santiago in Chile because Chile has a huge mining industry. And that was one of the reasons we ended
Right.
up in Canada. And it's why my dad was able to find work right away in Canada when we came in the 70s, which I think is pretty close to when you came. Um, it was because
Exactly.
of my dad's
Exactly.
physical metallurgy background. We came to Regina because there's a steel mill here, Evraz, and because of the mining industry.
No, that's bizarre, man. Yes, they're very, very close then because physical metallurgy was a passport to certainly get into this country. And so yeah, so that's where I was. That answers your question, I guess. And I came to a. If you're going to ask me where I worked when I came here, I came to an equally as broad company as the one that I was working with at the shipyard. Even though at the shipyard you think ships. I mean, I was telling you that on a submarine you've got everything. Well, the company I came to here, which is no longer around, unfortunately, was very similar in its mentality. It took me in, and I was quite reasonably experienced then, and said, "Hey, you come from Europe. This is the North American way. Read this standard, read that standard, read this standard, and this is the way we work." And they were another company that was absolutely excellent in the way it trained its people, all the way from the shop floor welders up until to the welding engineers. And you don't see as much of that anymore as you used to,
You
because the
know,
companies are just not big enough to do it.
yeah, and that's true. And
But yeah,
some of those huge companies that existed, they got broken apart and came apart. Like I remember when we came to Canada, my dad worked for Dominion Bridge for a long time, and he had a great career at Dominion Bridge. And some of those big
this is
companies.
very, this is very, this is very odd, Max, because that's who hired me.
Oh, really?
Yes, so that's who hired me from England. Dominion Bridge, Montreal hired me,
Yeah. So.
and you're right. They unfortunately they went to the wall. It kind of petered out during the 80s, late 80s, but I think they kept it around on a construction basis, probably into the night. I can't tell. But when the time you came, and with your family, and the time I was hired too, they were a big, big company. So your father was hired into the Regina plant?
Yep.
Okay.
Would have
Well,
been
I think I was.
1977. Yeah.
Yeah. Wow. So it's big companies like that. I mean, even when they were globally known. I mean, when I handed my notice in at the company I was working with in Leicester, England, and said I'm going to Canada and I'm going to go be working for Dominion Bridge, that company knew all about Dominion Bridge. They knew more about it than I did.
And it's interesting as immigrants that people don't realize the chain of events that's going to happen over the next 30, 40, 50 years of a person's life. Because,
Correct.
I've worked for some big companies that exist in Canada now, and the big companies can afford to bring in immigrants on contracts and bring in the best of the best from other countries. And sometimes the locals will be a little bit upset and say, well, these immigrants are coming in. But they don't realize that they'll end up being the Mick Pates of the future or the Sebastians like my dad, where 40 years later they've contributed their whole life into the steel trades, and it's all positive. And we're going to get to it a little bit later, but how much you've given back to the steel trades in your career.
Well, I like to think I have. I like to think I should have had more opportunity to do it. But I don't know about you. I mean, from the moment I stepped off the plane, I don't think I've had a day, Max, in the business where I've been able to put my feet up and say, I'm bored. It's been truly, truly fruitful. And if you get your hooks into this business and you get into the right areas, it's just a wonderful, enjoyable business to be in. I mean, people look at welding and that's part of our problem in marketing, bashing metal and stuff like that. But it's complex, and the stuff that people don't realize maybe it's something we'll talk about in the second half, how we don't market ourselves properly. We should be marketing ourselves to families, to mothers and dads. I mean, here we are in a pandemic, and without people in the trades, the place would be grinding to a halt. But these guys are still out there working because they have to.
Mm-hmm.
It's necessary work, and we don't make enough of it. I mean, every time we switch the light on, the light only goes on because of people like you and me and people who weld,
Mm-hmm. Exactly.
And more of that should be made. And the foundation and people like, oh, not so much the foundation, I guess, but the association should be advertised. I remember seeing a wonderful advert once when I was in Edmonton Airport. And I'd been teaching at the Bureau in Nisku, and I was sitting there waiting for my plane. And it was an ad, I think, for electrical technologists in Alberta. And it just showed, an outlet on the wall, electrical outlet with the plug unplugged, and it said, no light without us. And it hit home.
Yeah.
And that's what we should be doing with welding, because mums and dads just see sparks and horror and dirt,
fire and danger.
exactly.
Yeah.
And it's not all like that.
I mean, some of it is like that.
Some of it's like that. You need it.
Yeah.
I mean, robots are never going to be able to go up in the middle of the north and repair a gas pipeline.
Absolutely.
Not in our lifetime, anyway. Right?
Well, this is a perfect time to take a break. 15 minutes has already flown by, Mick. It's a amazing conversation. So we're going to take a quick break for the sponsors, and then we'll be back to continue on with the story of Mick and what's going on. So stay tuned here on the CWB Association podcast. And we're back here with Mick Pates. I'm Max Ceron. Thanks for tuning in to another edition of the CWB Association podcast. Fantastic conversation here talking about initially, where you came from in the UK, coming over to Canada to work for Dominion Bridge, large company that was able to bring you in and basically sponsor you into the beginning of your career here. When you landed, you landed in Montreal? Is that where you landed, or where did you land with Dominion Bridge?
Yeah, I landed in Montreal. They had a system, and you may know this from your father, but they had a system of profit centers, and so they had profit centers all over Canada. And at that time, they were aggressively purchasing fabrication companies in the States, and some of them were quite small. And so they had a system where they had like a corporate group, and that corporate group was meant to service all these profit centers. Some of them not big enough to have their own people. So, for instance, Montreal Plant and Machine was big, 1,500 people. So they had their own welding engineers, but they had a smaller group somewhere in who knows where, and they didn't have welding engineers or people. So the corporate group was supposed to service them. And so I landed in Montreal and went to work for that group, and it had its own laboratory as well. So we did, and most of the lab work was based on process development. So we do process development, and then we go off into the groups all over the country. In fact, my first job, this is when you get to know how big the country is.
Mm-hmm. That sounds pretty exciting.
Well, yeah, my boss came to me and said, there's been a fire on a bridge in BC. Here's your ticket. Go find out the problem, basically. And there'd been a fire on a bridge across the Fraser Valley. And I think it was a CP bridge. It had to be because Dominion Bridge was owned by CP. And the fire had burnt for a while. The sleepers, the ties had all gone up, soaked in kerosene or whatever they are, and they were wooden. They'd all gone up, and the fire had gone for a while. And they couldn't get equipment near it. It was steep slopes, and they were flying water bombers down. So my job was to go there and get some samples of the steel, so that we could find out whether the fire had affected the metallurgical properties of the bridge, whether it had gone high enough.
And did it?
To change. No, it hadn't. But I mean, the adventure was crazy. I mean, I don't think I've been in the country more than 2 weeks, and I'm sitting on a plane and I'm going 5 hours away. That's like when I'm in the UK. That was like flying to North Africa.
Yeah.
And we're in the same country.
Yeah.
And you get off the plane in BC and you drive up the Fraser Valley, and you claw your way. You find some motel and you claw your way down to the bridge. And there was only one guy there, a steel worker, when I got there. And it was a mess. It was a mess. It was.
And you know, that's
That,
funny
that, that-
for immigrants that are listening from other countries or people from other countries that are listening to the show. It's hard to understand the scope of how large Canada is. It's
yeah, it's
huge.
very big. It's very big. On the bridge, I'll never forget it. The rail, it had been so hot that the rails had twisted like spaghetti. The steel worker with his oxyacetylene equipment just walked across that bridge like it was nothing. I was literally crawling on my hands and knees across the dam. It was high up
Yeah, yeah.
over the river. Anyway, enough said. So that was one of the first jobs.
So when did you have a family at this point? Did you come from the UK with the family, or were you flying solo?
I came with a wife. Didn't last too much longer than that, but yes, I came, but we didn't. I didn't have children,
Okay. Yeah.
so it was just the two of us. And my wife actually, then my partner then was actually grew up in Canada, even though she was European. Her parents had been part of the early immigrant stream, but
Hmm.
they'd actually gone back to the UK to retire. But she was basically Canadian.
Okay.
So, and she grew up in Montreal, so
So
it was
this is
good.
very
So we
much
came up.
this is very much the typical Canadian welding story then, since you have at least one wife. So
Yes, if you get into it, Max, you're right. If you get into it, you may be all over the world on somebody else's penny, which is a great advantage of it.
hmm
But you may be not at home that much.
that's exactly what happened to me too with my first wife, and she's a great woman. She's done a great job, and I'm happy for her. But as a young welder, for me, traveling all over the world, it doesn't do well for a home life.
No, it is true. Yeah, yeah. So yeah, it was in all aspects. I was basically single. So
So,
yeah,
so you're
it's good.
working at the company. At this point, are you looking forward? Like, I'm going to start. I want to continue my education, or I want to maybe get out of the company, maybe get into education. Do you want? What were you kind of thinking at now your early 30s, career-wise? What were you kind of thinking?
That's a good question because Dominion Bridge was offered me so much. I mean, every day was different.
Hmm.
And I was flying around, I mean, into the States a lot. We had specific problems with various fabricators. I mean, they bought companies that were not, they were in a bit of trouble and they went in and turned them around. And that's what they did. And a
Hmm.
lot of the problems they had were the welding problems. They
Yeah.
weren't trained, they didn't know what they were doing at the time. So we were in there fixing it. So I had no desire to
To leave.
leave that company, to be frank, at the time. And I was still in my 30s. And they moved to Montreal, the corporate, it was all part of what was going on then with Quebec and the rest of Canada. They moved the corporate office to Ottawa and built another lab. And so that's how we ended up in Ottawa.
Hmm.
And they had this wonderful state of the art laboratory, uh, scanning electron microscopes, the whole deal. And we were doing electro slag welding, and we were the first people to get our hands on pulse MIG welders, synergic welders. We went over to Europe and bought a bunch of them and brought them in there and tested them and advised the profit centers which to buy. I mean, that's exciting work.
Yeah.
Why would you want to leave? And then all of a sudden, bang,
It was
the
over.
company came on hard times, and the first people to cut is the corporate staff. So we got cut.
Hmm.
So, and then I had to start thinking about my future. And it went off in various different places, essentially working for a small, or creating actually,
Hmm.
with some of the people from the old Dominion Bridge group I worked with, creating a thing called the Materials Technology Centre, which evolved into fleet technology, which is now evolved into BMT, if you've heard of those guys.
Hmm.
There in Ottawa. It started off from a kernel of people from the old Dominion Bridge. I worked there for a while and then ended up working for the Bureau. I wanted to change actually. When I got into BMT, we were essentially doing the same stuff, and it was a smaller company, and I wanted to change. And my old boss had gone to the Bureau, and the Hibernia project came up, and I had a little bit of offshore experience, not a lot, but a little bit. And I wanted to get my teeth into that, and so I went down for an interview and got hired,
Hmm.
and off I went to work for the Bureau on the Hibernia project. That was more of a certification process. It wasn't so much I mean, we were qualifying welders and procedures, but the great thing about that one was the fact that we were doing. I'm rambling on here, Max. So
Yeah,
just
no,
shut
and
me
that's
down.
no, it's good because you know what that is a lot of what happens in the CWB world, right? Is that it's not so much at this point in your career you're realizing that it's not you're getting pulled away from the research side and you're getting put more into the tactile certification side,
Yeah, it
right?
was. Yeah,
Where you're not developing procedures, you're just making sure people are following them, right?
no, we were working with people who were developing procedures. The
Mm-hmm.
great thing about that whole project was it was brand new to Canada, and it was brand new to a lot of the offshore business too, because the environment off the Newfoundland coast was awful.
Mm-hmm.
Minus 65, wave climates. So we had a lot of we had to develop together with the fabricators that won the contracts to build portions of the stuff, the weld procedures and qualify the welders to brand new Canadian standards at the time.
Mm-hmm.
So it was exciting and it was global. We were all over the place. We were in Europe and we were in Far East and
Yeah, that sounds fun.
traveling around a
Yeah,
bit. Pardon?
it sounds a lot like a lot of fun.
It was, and so it was all kind of based around Newfoundland. The bureau had its office in Mississauga at the time, before it moved to Milton, and a team of us worked for that. I just led it. Managed to get my hands on some bright guys within that organisation. One of which is the current leader, Doug Luciani. Worked
Yeah.
for me for a while on that project when he was quite young. Um, so yeah, that was great. But then when that project stopped, Max, it was like I've been on a plane for 3 years going around the world. It was like,
Mm-hmm.
okay, what do I do now?
Did you start getting the feeling that you wanted to settle down and plant some roots at this point, or did you still have the itch to get out there and do crazy stuff?
I unfortunately, when I was working on Hibernia, I was working out of Toronto, and I didn't have time to make any friends or build up a life around myself because I was constantly on a plane going
Mm-hmm.
elsewhere. So I really only headquartered myself in Toronto. I was very fortunate in a way that guys from work I mucked around with, but I didn't have a chance to build it beyond that, and it's always been part of the way I operate is that get people outside of people you work with as part of your social life. So eventually, I was persuaded to go back to the company I'd left in Ottawa, which is now BMT Fleet,
Mm-hmm.
because Hibernia was just like a house on fire, and then when it stopped, it was like just the burning embers. There was nothing going on, so I moved back to Ottawa, picked up the work I'd left before going to work on that project, and then
Yeah.
eventually got working with. And this is interesting because I was
Mm-hmm.
starting to get a bit long in the tooth. I got offered a job welding zirconium and tantalum and titanium using electron beam welders. I mean,
That's
if I
cool.
fell down the toilet, Max, I'd come up smelling of roses. I was just very, very lucky.
Yeah.
Very lucky.
So how did you end up getting back on the tools with such rare metals? Like how
Well,
does someone
I
get
was
offered that
connect.
job?
I had a connection into the company that offered me the job. It was a quiet company. Like a lot of people that work in the nuclear business keep it quiet
Mm-hmm.
because of obvious concerns.
Mm-hmm.
And they were zirconium is a material that they use in nuclear reactors, and the company that was making the pressure tubes for Canberra reactors operated just outside of Ottawa, and they're still there, and they hired me. So they wanted to expand the welding group, which was essentially electron beam welding,
Mm-hmm.
and some GTAW, TIG welding. So we built on what they had and expanded that into weld repairing aircraft components. We
Yeah.
were quite often asked to go to the airport to fix planes. It was fascinating.
And that's it's
Fascinating.
awesome to hear because as young welders coming up, you always in the textbooks you will see, laser beam welding, electron beam welding. You'll see these terms. You have to learn about them a little bit to pass a test, and you never think about them again because you don't really think that they're real jobs. Like there's not a real job out there for an electron beam welder, but they are. They exist.
Yeah, it's rare. I don't know what the situation is now because I'm no longer with that company, and I haven't been with them for about 10 years now. But I was there, I think there were maybe outside of the government operations, like National Research Council, I believe in Montreal has a couple. There were very few electron beam welders. And I think there's one near you in Winnipeg. I think Bristol Aerospace had one. If Bristol Aerospace is still around, I'm not sure.
Hmm.
So maybe there was at the most 4 or 5 in the country
Yeah.
in the private sector.
What a neat
And
niche.
so yeah, it's rare. Yeah,
Yeah.
we had one, and then we expanded and bought a second one, a bigger one. And of course, the problem with electron beam, the way we were using it, full vacuum, is the size of the vacuum box. You go from small components with a small vacuum box, 3 by 3 by 3, or meter by meter by meter, and then you want to do bigger stuff, and you've got to drive a forklift into a vacuum box, and it takes all night to pump the vacuum down before you do one weld. It's fascinating. It's completely the other side of the coin from arc welding.
Hmm. Now,
Fascinating
so now
stuff.
you're,
So,
like you said, you're starting to get long in the tooth. Are you thinking retirement? Like you're coming up on
yes, I am
50s?
very long.
Like, are you
Well,
semi-retired now? Are you retired? What's going on?
I'm on the road to retirement, put it that way. But like we spoke about earlier, Max, my partner's a bit younger than me, so she's also working full time. And I, if you're working something where you've never had a bad day, I mean, I've had bad days. Don't get me wrong. I mean, a lot of pressure, but bad days in terms of
Just getting pissed
excitement.
off or something?
It doesn't happen very often.
Hmm.
So if you're still enjoying it, why stop?
Yeah.
So I still do it, but I'm not doing it full time. No, I mean I'm working on. I guess I can afford to be choosy.
Hmm.
It's nothing to do with the money. It's never had anything to do with it for me. It's all about the technical challenge. Um, so yeah, I'm still doing it. And yesterday I was involved in some weld procedures that are being developed in the UK for a local client here. The week before, I was involved in trying to find out a pressure vessel that had been welded in 1958 and which was cracking, how quickly could we use it and get it certified under our local pressure vessel people here. So, rip out some samples and send them to the lab and come up with some. So that kind of work I'm still doing. And I have an associate who's also an Expiro guy.
Hmm.
And we do return services under 47 and 47.2
Oh, good.
for a bunch of local companies.
Now,
And we were very active in the association, actually. I mean,
that's what I was
myself and
going to
my
ask you,
partner
how
were.
the association is for you in your area and your activity with the association.
Well, my associate, Bill Eccles, who did work for the Bureau as well, started the local chapter up in the late 90s, I believe, and knocked on my door and said, can you be chair? And 25 years later, I was still chair. 25 years later, close to that.
Hmm.
You will know yourself that it's when you're working in that, there's a lot of volunteer hours. And so I had to get out and give it to somebody else. I mean, the youth needs to get in there. But we had a very good chapter here. We made sure that our meetings we had a philosophy, quality, not quantity. We didn't have that many meetings, Max, but what we had were good. We always got good feedback.
Hmm.
We always got 40 to 50 people a night. One night we had 80. So, we did quite well. And of course, with COVID, I'm not sure what's going on at the moment with the local chapter. I know the guy who's leading it, but I don't think they're active at the moment with COVID.
Well,
Obviously,
I'm working
people
on
don't
changing
meet.
that right now because, virtually the tech is changing, and for the new generations coming up, they have no problems with using the tech to meet people and network, and in many cases they prefer it. A lot of the older chapters were seeing a decline in the numbers attending, but that's because it was kind of the old platform that the new people weren't
Yeah,
involved with. And it's an interesting conversation. I just had this conversation with an older fellow the other day, and he was very wise about it because he said, since the beginning of man, it has always been the older generation reaching down to the younger generation to try to teach them. Young people don't ask to get taught because they're stubborn and they're strong-willed, and it's been like that since forever. It's always been the role of the wise older person to impart their wisdom down into the new generation. And with technology now, there's a bit of a gap because the older generation is kind of saying, well, I don't want to use your technology to communicate with you. And that's not right, because we can't force them to do it our way. It's up to us to learn to do it theirs, because they're the next in line. So really, it's what we got to find out what they need and how they like to communicate, and work with them. And that's something that I'm working on now, is trying to get some better online virtual systems going, because as you know, in your career, in your life, the community of welding, the community of the steel trades is huge. And people remember people, and when you work with good people, you encounter them repeatedly in your career at different places, you know.
That's true. It is, even though it's a big world, it's a small world, if you know what I mean.
Mhm.
You know, you're forever crossing paths with people that you've known or hearing about them one way or the other as you go through. And I agree with you that that with regard to the, you know, the gap between the wise old farts like maybe I'm becoming and the younger people. I mean, there is a gap. There is. I mean, I have a frustration with the way I get my knowledge over because um, I'm not. I can't say that I don't know how to use the platforms. I do. Um, I don't always want to use them.
And
So yes, you're right.
that maybe is the issue,
Yeah,
you know. It's not sitting around at a pub with
yeah.
beers anymore, which, you know, I still would prefer much more imparting wisdom over a pitcher of beer in a pub. That's still my favorite way of having these discussions, but you know, that's not for me to decide anymore.
That's true. That's true, Max. And I have to say that some of the best meetings over a pint in a pub took place in South America. During that time, I was working there where you were born. Those guys really know how to do it.
Yeah, you know,
They
that's
know how to
something.
do it.
I don't know if I've met, I don't know if I've been around you at any of the educators conference or stuff, but you got to make sure you come out to the next one, because I know how to impart wisdom over a pint. Trust me.
Well, okay, then that would be good. That would be great, Max. Yeah, that would be very good.
So Mick, are you working on any projects with the CWB right now? Like, are you, like, I know you did some content development for us and stuff like that, and
No, I'm not really. I mean, I'm doing one or two little things for Matt,
hmm
but I'm not working on anything
specifically, you know.
that I was working before. I mean,
Yeah.
we developed some programs for. I'm not exactly sure where these things end up within the bureau. I mean, I was just a contractor writing stuff, but essentially, I think most of it was for their inspector program.
hmm
Um, they were compiling the modules into one booklet, I think, but I'm not sure what came out the other end of it. To be honest with you, Matt,
hmm
I worked with them and we did what we had to do. You know, it was basically technical content. Yeah,
Yeah.
that was it.
So I
So
get,
no, I'm not doing a lot
I
with the bureau at the moment.
I feel like from this conversation and your attitude that you're probably gonna stay working right until the last kick.
Yes, well, you may well be right on that one, Max. I'm not sure.
And that's a good thing.
I'm
That's a
not
good thing.
sure. It's like, yeah, you know, do you want a pint? Yeah, it's hard to say no. You know what I mean? It's hard to say no
I do
sometimes. If
know.
it's yeah, so
All right, so we're coming up on the
ask
end.
me another.
Yeah, we're coming up on the end of the interview here, and this is a question I always ask everybody, and I'm going to ask you the same. And if you had a group of young people in front of you, kind of maybe going through school for the first time for welding or maybe engineering, or just you know, just beginning their career in the steel trades. Now, you looking back on your life, what would be some you know, hints or information or tricks that you would maybe give them or try to impart on them as guidance into their future careers? What would you say to them, um, moving forward?
That's a tough one. That
Mm-hmm.
is a tough one, to be frank. Depends where you're starting from. The thing is, you've always got to listen. And one thing I would say is double check information. Go to books, go to the websites, double check information. There's a lot of loose information out there, and I'm sure you know what I'm talking about.
Mm-hmm.
And so, accurately check stuff, learn, always learn, but always question, always go, why? Why is he saying that? Why is that? Why is that? I mean, there are some things going out there that are not good, and we
Mm-hmm.
need to get around that, and that's by listening. I mean, people are still welding stainless to carbon steel with carbon steel electrodes, for instance, because we're not teaching it right. So learn from everybody, and don't be afraid of learning from the internet and books, because that's where it's real, it's the truth, and massage your hands-on knowledge with that you can find on the internet to solidify it, and then just go forward. I mean, it's very, very easy for people to say, well, I just want to do this, but keep your eyes open wide, because the opportunity in this business is huge, and it depends an awful lot on what you said earlier, whether you're a family person or whether you can get out and on the road. But the opportunity in this business that we're in is global. If you want to see the world, stick to this business. You can do it.
Mm-hmm.
So eyes open, learn from everything you see, and you'll end up with doing well for yourself and enjoying what you're doing. And bottom line is, you've got to enjoy it. If you're not enjoying it, move on.
Yeah, that's fantastic.
That's what I would say.
And it's so true. If you're not enjoying what you're doing, it's hard to look ahead with your eyes open, because you start just kind of getting stuck, and once you start kind of spinning your wheels in the muck, then it's hard to really feel good about yourself.
And it's true, and you need to be able to advertise yourself to people that don't know what you do. I mean, every time you drive over a steel bridge, you can say it to your partner or your wife or your friends, hey, I helped build those things.
Mm-hmm. Take pride in it.
How would you get to the other side without me? I mean, it's stuff like that you have to do. Every time you switch the light on, I helped to do that.
Yeah, and I love that analogy
I
of the light
helped
socket.
provide. I've got a long story about that one, but I can't tell it on the air.
All right, Mick. Well, I would love to check in with you in a bit and see what's going on. I feel like you got a lot of stories that you could tell, and I might have to hit you up for some more, because I love hearing them. I love hearing them. I grew up in the steel trades. My dad was a boiler maker and metallurgist, and I grew up around steel my whole life. I live and breathe steel since I was a little boy. And talking to a person like yourself, very much the same story. And I really appreciate how the industry has affected your life as much as it's affected mine and many others. No.
I think I've got a call.
Okay, well, I'll talk to you later,
Max.
Mick. Thanks a lot. I appreciate it.
Thank you very much.
Okay, bye-bye.
Thank you very much. Okay, talk soon.
Bye-bye.
We hope you enjoyed the show.
You've been listening to the CWB Association Welding Podcast with Max Ceron. If you enjoyed what you heard today, rate our podcast and visit us at cwbassociation.org to learn more. Feel free to contact us if you have any questions or suggestions on what you'd like to learn about in the future. Produced by the CWB Group and presented by Max Ceron. This podcast serves to educate and connect the welding community. Please subscribe, and thank you for listening.